Francis, as a believer and as a rigorous scientist, you come across, as I've come across, many arguments purporting to prove why God exists. I would think that as a believer, you get pretty frustrated with some of them because they would actually turn off most people. What are some of these fallacies that you've heard that people have thrown around trying to prove what you know to be true, but really do it in a way which casts aspersion on that conclusion?
I think most of them fall into the general category of trying to insert God into some aspect of human experience that isn't necessarily a good fit, a God of the gaps approach. Obviously, a major argument that many still adhere to is the evidence for design that we see around us in living things. And this carried a lot of weight before Darwin came along, but in fact is not an argument which, in the context of understanding the correctness of evolution, is a good way to convince anybody of God as the specific creator of this or that phenomenon. A version of that is the argument of you have to believe in God because of the beauty of this particular landscape or this flower. I see as a believer that those are in fact beautiful things, and I see God's hand in that in a general way, but I don't see God's hand in having made it possible for that flower to have that particular beautiful pink pigment in its petals. That is something molecular biology can do for you. Other arguments, certainly the miraculous. Many people do, I think, come to the idea that faith can only be proven by pointing to specific miraculous events that are part of their faith tradition, and many of those are very difficult to document as having been something other than a misunderstanding of a natural event. And that won't convince anybody who's already a skeptic, and yet it's often put on the table in those discussions. A particularly prominent recent version of this is the argument about intelligent design, or ID, which says that God had to step in and fix evolution because some of the molecular machines we find inside our cells are just too complicated for evolution to have come up with on its own. Interesting discussions. Not a useful way to try to make a case for the existence of God, because the closer you look, the more you realize that those are not all that irreducible in their complexity after all. And it's a modern version of this same fallacy that we've undertaken at many times in the past of trying to put God into a box, trying to say, well, God must be there because science hasn't explained it yet.
That's the God of the gap.
That's the God of the gap.
There's a gap in your explanation.
Right.
And that's where you insert God.
Right. And then you sort of stand there.
And when that's explained, you find a new gap.
Right. Or else you find that a lot of people are no longer listening to you because you made this strong argument that that's where God was and you were wrong. And so why should they pay attention
the next
next
time?
Home. Yeah.